More than 33 years after 3 8-year-old boys were murdered in West Memphis, Arkansas, the most important witness may be a knot. And it may contain the evidence that could finally reveal who killed the 3 boys. The shoelaces used to bind Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers are now at a private Virginia laboratory where scientists are expected to use modern DNA methods, including a wet vacuum collection system designed to pull microscopic material from deep inside fabric. The hope is simple. Whoever tied those knots may have left skin cells behind. A match could point to a known person, lead investigators through genetic genealogy to a name nobody has considered, or reshape one of America's most disputed murder cases. It could also produce nothing at all. This is what is being tested, why it took so long, and what every possible result would actually mean. 3 boys in Robin Hood Hills. On May 5, 1993, Steve, often called Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers disappeared while riding bicycles in their West Memphis neighborhood. All 3 were 8 years old. The following afternoon, searchers found their bodies in a muddy drainage channel in an area known as Robin Hood Hills. The boys were naked. Their wrists had been tied to their ankles behind their backs, using their own shoelaces. Their clothes and bicycles were recovered nearby. It was a horrifying crime scene, and the pressure to find the killer was immediate. Police eventually focused on 3 local teenagers, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Misskelley Jr. The investigation unfolded during the height of America's so-called satanic panic, and prosecutors presented the murders as an occult ritual. Eccles' interest in dark clothing, heavy metal music, and unconventional beliefs became part of the case's public mythology. The most important evidence against the teenagers was Misskelley's confession, but the statement came after a lengthy interrogation, only a small portion of which was recorded, and it repeatedly conflicted with known facts. Misskelley initially placed the crime in the morning, when the children were still at school. He said the boys had been tied with rope, not shoelaces. Other details changed as investigators corrected him. Misskelley was tried separately and convicted. Eccles and Baldwin were convicted in a second trial in 1994. Baldwin received life without parole. Eccles was sentenced to death. But the case never settled. The documentary series Paradise Lost exposed the investigation and trials to a worldwide audience. Witnesses recanted. Forensic experts challenged the prosecution's interpretation of injuries. And crucially, later testing failed to place the 3 convicted men at the crime scene through DNA. In 2011, after 18 years in prison, Eccles, Baldwin, and Misskelley entered Alford pleas. That unusual plea allowed them to maintain their innocence, while acknowledging that the state claimed it had enough evidence to convict them. They were released with time served. Legally, however, the convictions remained. That distinction is the engine driving everything happening now. The 3 men are free, but they are not exonerated. The murders are not officially unsolved, and the families of Steve, Michael, and Christopher still live with a case that has generated arguments, suspects, documentaries, and theories, but no universally accepted answer. The evidence that survived. The renewed DNA effort nearly ended before it began. Damien Eccles' team started pushing in 2020 to test the ligatures with technology unavailable at the time of the murders. For a period, attorneys were told that evidence may have been destroyed in a fire. In late 2021, however, material from the case was located in police custody. The surviving evidence included the shoelace ligatures, the objects most likely to have been handled directly by the person who restrained the boys. That discovery raised an obvious question. If the evidence still existed, why not test it? The answer became a years-long legal battle. Then prosecutor Scott Ellington had discussed an agreement for testing, but after leaving office, his successor, Keith Crestman, required Eccles to pursue the request in court and opposed the petition. A circuit judge rejected Eccles' request in 2022, reasoning that Arkansas's post-conviction DNA law did not apply because Eccles was no longer in state custody. In April 2024, the Arkansas Supreme Court reversed that decision. The majority ruled that Arkansas Act 1780 allows a person convicted of a crime to seek new scientific testing to support a claim of actual innocence. The statute did not say that person must still be in prison. The court also rejected the argument that an Alford plea automatically prevented Eccles from asserting actual innocence. That ruling did not itself declare the West Memphis Three innocent, and it did not directly order a laboratory to begin. It sent the case back to the circuit court so the testing request could proceed. By 2025, the tone from the state had changed. Second Judicial District Prosecutor Sonia Hagood negotiated an agreed order with the defense. She acknowledged the risks: decades of storage, handling without gloves in the early years, possible contamination, and the improbability of certifying that every item remained untouched. But she also said testing was worth attempting. In her words, it might produce nothing, or a silver bullet that explains the case. On August 1, 2025, Circuit Judge Tonya Alexander approved the agreement. The order covered roughly 15 categories of evidence, including ligatures and hair samples. Reporting on the order also identified hairs associated with the victims and a hair attributed to Steve Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, among the comparison material. All three members of the West Memphis Three agreed to the process and to pay for it. They waived objections to destructive testing, meaning extraction could consume biological material and potentially eliminate another chance to test it later. The state and defense received equal access to procedures and results, while both preserved the right to dispute what any result means in court. That last point matters. A DNA result is data. Its meaning will still be argued. The evidence was transferred in the fall of 2025 to Bode Technology, also known as Bode Laboratories, a private forensic DNA laboratory in Virginia. In June 2026, Eccles spokesman Lonnie Sowry said the ligatures, hairs, and possibly other items were still at Bode and expressed hope that testing would be completed by the end of July. Recent reports have not been perfectly consistent about whether laboratory processing was already underway or about to begin. What is clear is that the evidence is at Bode. The summer of 2026 is the defense's publicly discussed target, and no verified result has been announced as of this recording. Why MVAC could matter. The name most often attached to this testing is MVAC, but MVAC is not a DNA database and it is not genetic genealogy. It is a collection tool. Traditional forensic collection often uses a swab rubbed across a surface. MVAC sprays a sterile solution while applying vacuum pressure, then captures the liquid and any cellular material released from the object. On a porous item like a shoelace, the aim is to reach between and beneath fibers where skin cells may have survived. That is especially important here. The ligatures were submerged in water, which can wash away or degrade DNA. But shoelaces are rough, and the knots may have trapped cells in places that water and earlier swabbing did not reach. MVAC's chief executive, Jared Bradley, has argued that if DNA remains on these items, the system offers a strong chance of collecting it. A 2020 study by FBI researchers found that MVAC produced greater nuclear DNA yields than wet swabbing on most porous surfaces tested. That does not guarantee success in this case. Laboratory experiments are not 33-year-old shoelaces recovered from a muddy creek, but it explains why the method is attractive. Once cells are collected, Bode still has to extract, quantify, amplify, and interpret the DNA using scientifically appropriate laboratory protocols. Analysts may look for an STR profile, the marker pattern commonly used for forensic comparison and database searching. Depending on the sample, they could also consider specialized approaches for male DNA, mitochondrial DNA from hair, or methods suited to degraded material. Investigative genetic genealogy is a later possibility, not a confirmed first step. It generally requires a sufficiently informative genetic profile that can be compared with profiles voluntarily uploaded to Permitic genealogy databases. Genealogists then search for relatives, build family trees, and narrow the family to a candidate. Investigators must confirm any lead with a direct forensic comparison. A family tree lead is not itself proof. So the process has gates. First, recover enough human DNA. Second, separate meaningful contributors from victims and contamination. Third, generate a usable profile. Only then can databases or genealogy potentially turn that profile into a name. What earlier DNA did and did not show. Modern testing is not beginning from zero. DNA work conducted years after the trials did not identify Eccles, Baldwin, or Miss Kelly as the source of the biological material tested. In 2007, mitochondrial testing on hares produced two findings that became central to later debate. One hair recovered from a ligature binding Michael Moore was consistent with Terry Hobbs, Steve Branch's stepfather, and a small fraction of the population. Another hair recovered from a tree stump near the scene was consistent with David Jacoby, a friend of Hobbs. Those findings were not nuclear DNA identifications. Mitochondrial DNA is shared along maternal lines and cannot uniquely identify one person. A hair consistent with Hobbs could have reached the scene through innocent transfer, especially because he lived with one victim. Hobbs has repeatedly denied involvement and has not been charged. That caution cuts both ways. The absence of the West Memphis Three's DNA on previously tested evidence does not mathematically prove they were never present, but a reliable profile from inside a binding knot could be far more probative than a loose hair, because location and context matter. The new effort may also revisit hairs with more sensitive methods and examine previously limited or unknown genetic information. Reporting in 2025 mentioned an unknown allele on one victim as a possible candidate for genealogy-related work, but it is not yet publicly established that Bode has produced a genealogy quality profile or that genealogical searching has begun. That is an important line between fact and hope. The testing may open the door to genealogy. It has not yet walked through it. The 5 results that could come back. The first possibility is the result everyone imagines. A strong DNA profile from a crucial location, such as material protected inside a knot, matches a known suspect or person of interest. That would be explosive, but not self-executing. Investigators would examine whether the person had an innocent reason to touch the victim, clothing or shoelace. They would review opportunity, alibi, prior statements, and chain of custody. A direct match to someone already connected to a child is easier to explain innocently than a match to a stranger. Multiple consistent samples, or a profile found in more than one protected knot, would be much harder to dismiss. Prosecutors could reopen the homicide investigation and seek a fresh reference sample. Charges would depend on corroboration, statutes, the person's status, and whether the evidence could survive challenges over contamination and handling. For Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly, a persuasive match to another perpetrator could support motions to vacate their convictions under Arkansas's actual innocence framework, but exoneration would still require a court order or action by the state. A laboratory report alone does not erase an Alford conviction. The second possibility is a usable profile that matches no known comparison sample and produces no hit in a criminal DNA database. This would be frustrating, but potentially powerful. If the profile contains enough information, investigators could pursue forensic genetic genealogy. A match to a distant cousin might eventually identify a family line and then a candidate who was the right age and in the West Memphis area in 1993. That process can take weeks, months, or longer. It can also end without a name because the relevant family is poorly represented in permitted databases. Even when genealogy identifies a candidate, investigators must obtain that person's DNA directly or from a legally collected discarded item and confirm the match. A clean, unknown male profile repeated on multiple ligatures could still change the legal picture before anyone is named. It could strengthen the argument that an unidentified person, not the 3 convicted teenagers, handled the bindings during the crime. The third possibility may be the most scientifically realistic, a complex mixture. The victim's DNA will likely dominate items that belong to them. Add relatives, searchers, police, lawyers, laboratory staff, decades of handling, and possible secondary transfer, and analysts may see overlapping contributors. Sensitive technology can detect more DNA, but more is not always clearer. Software may help estimate how strongly a mixture supports one explanation over another, but a low-level contributor can be difficult to interpret. The state has already warned that contamination could become the central dispute. Both sides reserve the right to challenge significance and admissibility for exactly this reason. The fourth possibility is an inconclusive or degraded result. Water, bacteria, heat, time, and prior testing can break DNA into fragments. MVAC may collect cells yet still fail to produce a profile complete enough for comparison. Or the remaining material may be consumed during testing without yielding an answer. That outcome would not prove the West Memphis 3 guilty. It would not clear another person. It would mean only that this evidence with today's methods could not resolve the question. And because the men accepted destructive testing, nothing usable could close one of the last major forensic paths in the case. The fifth possibility must be confronted directly. DNA matching Eccles, Baldwin, or Miss Kelly. The legal impact would depend entirely on where, how much, and how reliable. A robust profile protected inside a binding knot, supported on multiple items and inconsistent with later contamination, would seriously damage their innocence claims and reinforce the existing convictions. Prosecutors would argue that modern science had finally connected one or more of them to critical evidence. But a trace profile on an exposed item would be less decisive. These exhibits have been handled across trials, appeals, inspections, and earlier laboratory work. Defense teams connected to the men have had lawful access to evidence. Analysts would need to consider when transfer could have occurred. Even a match would not automatically create a new prosecution for the same murders. The convictions already exist. Instead, it would likely defeat the exoneration effort and intensify the argument that the Alford pleas should remain final. What the families and the 3 men are waiting for. This story is often framed around the West Memphis 3, but the center of it is 3 murdered children. Members of the victims' families have not always agreed about the convictions or alternative suspects. Steve Branch's mother, Pam Hicks, has publicly questioned the original investigation and demanded answers. Other relatives have defended the convictions or objected to years of renewed accusations and publicity. No DNA result can undo what these families have endured. Jason Baldwin, the only one of the 3 men present at the August 2025 hearing, said the DNA would not match him. "We want the truth," he told public radio. Eccles has said the testing could solve the case once and for all. Their willingness to risk consuming the evidence is part of their argument. They say they want the science followed wherever it goes. The state's current position is more measured. Prosecutor Sonia Hagood agreed to test, but emphasized that old evidence is not a pristine time capsule. A striking result could still trigger a courtroom fight over contamination, relevance, and whether the profile came from the killer at all. Conclusion: the most likely answer. So what result should we realistically expect? The most likely outcome is not an instant name. It is a partial or mixed profile, possibly new, possibly excluding some people, but surrounded by questions about age, water exposure, transfer, and handling. That is the cautious conclusion, supported by the condition of the evidence and by the prosecutor's own warning. MVAC improves collection. It does not reverse degradation or tell us when a cell arrived. The next most plausible outcome is no interpretable profile at all, but most likely is not the same as inevitable. The knots are the reason this test matters. Tight, porous folds may have protected cells left by the hands that tied them. If Bode recovers the same unknown profile from more than one ligature, and especially from inside separate knots, the finding could be far more significant than a single stray hair. A database hit or genetic genealogy lead would then move this case from historical argument to active investigation. The breakthrough may arrive as a name. More likely, it will arrive first as a string of genetic markers, followed by months of careful work and fierce legal debate.